Hello and welcome to the next edition of the BriefingsDirect Voice of the Customer podcast series. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host and moderator for this ongoing discussion on the latest insights into hybrid IT and cloud computing. Our next cloud adoption best practices discussion focuses on some of the strictest security and performance requirements for a new global finance services deployment. We'll now explore how a major financial transactions provider is exploiting cloud models to extend a distributed real-time payments capability across the globe. Due to the needs for localized data storage, privacy regulations compliance, and lightning-fast transaction speeds, this extreme cloud use formula pushes the boundaries and possibilities for cloud solutions. Stay with us now as we hear from an executive at Mastercard and a cloud deployment strategist on a new cutting-edge use for cloud infrastructure. Please join me now in welcoming our guests. We're here with Paolo Pellizzoli, Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at RealTime Payments International for Mastercard. Welcome, Paolo.
Thank you.
We're also here with Robert Christensen, Vice President and Cloud Strategist at Cloud Technology Partners, a Hewlett-Packard Enterprise company. Welcome, Robert.
Thank you for having me. Good to be here.
We're glad you're here again. It seems like we're sort of now beginning to push the boundaries to a new level on what cloud can be used for. So what is happening with the adoption of cloud that satisfies concerns such as strict security and localized data and top-rate performance? Let's start with you, Robert. What's now allowing for sort of a new bleeding edge to creep out when it comes to the use of cloud?
I think there's a number of use cases that have been coming up that have been made public. You see, some of the front runners, with Capital One and some other organizations who have taken some core applications that would otherwise be considered sacred, and they're moving them to cloud applications, cloud platforms, And so those have been becoming more and more evident and visible, and the CIO, Rob Alexander, has been very vocal about that. And then so others have followed suit. The feds, at least in the United States, have been much more accepting around the audit and controls. We're seeing a lot more governance and automation being happen as well. So a number of the things that tie the business objectives, the control objectives of security to the actual technologies for the implementation are becoming more and more accepted practices today. So by default, folks like Paolo, who's on here, are going to start considering really pushing and driving towards more and more solutions that could give them a competitive edge. So I just think we're just seeing a lot more acceptance of it over the last 18 months.
Paolo, is this just a matter of gaining more confidence, or is there something that is more empirical, some sort of proof point that you look to that sort of opens the gates for more cloud adoption?
I think as we start seeing what's happening in the world with nationalism, on-soil requirements starting to become much more prevalent, and we think it will continue, is the ability to reach those countries and to be able to go through and deploy quickly in those countries and allow persistence to occur there. Now, the adoption side of it is a double-edged sword. I think everybody wants to get there, and I think everybody intuitively knows that they can get there. But there are a lot of controls around privacy, the SOC compliance and everything that need to be adjusted to take into account the cloud. And also, if the cloud is rerouting traffic because, one zone goes down and it flips to another zone, is that within the same borders, et cetera? And how do you prove that? So I think that while technologically it can be done, from a compliance perspective, there's a lot of different boxes to check before somebody's going to go through and allow payments data to flow actively across the cloud, because that's really, the panacea.
Right. We've certainly seen a lag between what technology is capable of and what regulation, law, and standards and best practices allow. Or what we're seeing now is a compression of that lag, or are the regulations, in effect, catching up to what the technology is capable of?
I think the technology is still way out in front. I think the regulation, they've got a lot on their plate, and I think that at this point, as we start moving, as long as we still can go through and adhere to all the regulations and the regulations between countries and within countries, is something that I think will continue to be a little bit of a lagging effect. That being said, you're starting to see governments starting to understand how sanctions occur and other things, and they're wanting their own networks within their own borders. Those are the types of things that a full-fledged payments network that predated the internet, the public internet, I should say. Those are the types of things that, as we start moving certain features, functions, and capabilities, we are basically redoing that payments grade network, as it were.
So, Robert, we have a situation where the technology is highly capable. We have a major player like Mastercard interested in taking advantage of some of these issues to solve some of their globalization requirements. What can innovation and solutions that are based more on methodologies bring to the table to sort of close that gap, even as we're waiting for the regulators? Is there some stopgap in between process or use of hybrid cloud, perhaps, that can help solve the logjam?
Well, for sure, the regionalization issues are up front, if not the number one requirement Apollo is talking about. I think about South Korea, right? They just was meeting with the largest bank folks there, and they are just planning now their adoption of public cloud, whether it's Azure or AWS or Google, but the laws are just now making it available that they can do it. Before, there was a mandate that you couldn't even do it. So we have a lot of that going on throughout the globe around just the laws making that happen. So the strategy seems to be very focused on putting the compute, the network, the storage, those type of things, localized, regionalized in place. And that's going to require technology grounding in some sort of connectivity across on-prem and public while still getting that security in place. So the abstraction of that movement, you may see more usage of things like OpenShift or Cloud Foundry's Pivotal platform and some overlay that allows folks to take advantage of that so that you can push down an appliance-like piece of equipment in a territory. So I'm not certain as to the cost that you incur as a result of adding that additional layer, but from a rollout, this is an upfront conversation with most financial organizations that are globalized. They want to be able to develop one way or deploy one way while having a regional or localized on-prem services that requires as few abstractions as that maybe they want to get done in the public cloud. That is happening in a multiple number of regions.
Paulo, tell me a little bit more about international real-time payments. Were you set up specifically to help solve this type of problem, or is there a larger mandate? What's the reason for splitting off this organization from Mastercard in general?
Well, this is not actually split off from Mastercard. Mastercard made an acquisition a number of years ago of Vocalink. Vocalink did real-time payments or real-time ACH for the United Kingdom. And what they've done is, because it's nationally critical infrastructure, and it's bank-to-bank ACH, we've extended it now so that it can go through and perform the same nationally critical functions for other governments in other countries. Vocalink was running, because it was an acquisition, running at arm's length, and we've just now integrated it back into Mastercard. And real-time payments will bring the ACH or the instant check kind of function alongside the debit, credit, loyalty, gift kind of mechanisms which Mastercard was traditionally known for. I do want to add one or two things that were mentioned. I think that as you start seeing, and I absolutely agree, you want to develop one way and deploy to multiple locations. As you've started seeing hybrid cloud with the advent of Azure Stack and more recently Amazon's Outpost, it kind of gives you cloud inside your data center with the same capabilities, the same consoles, the same, scripting and automation, etc. I think that, as we start seeing those mechanisms become richer and more robust, we will go through and be deploying to any and all. I think even as low as being able to be embedded within a point of sale device. As we start really taking a look at it, the differences between governments, regulation, and so on and so forth really come down to personally identifiable information. You can secure the transaction information by abstracting out all the other stuff and doing some interesting cryptography that only those governments know about. so that the flow will still go through and be there. We provide a lot of fraud detection and other value-added services for the issuers or the banks, all the way down to the consumers to protect them. And I think as we start going through and seeing the globalization, but also the regionalization through regulation, it's interesting how you start watching fraudulent activity traverse the globe from different countries. And we do have some unique insights into that as well.
The way I've been talking with clients is along this cloud appliance type strategy. So back to the hybrid world, right? If you really think about the Outpost and the Azure Stack as the opportunity for globalization at speed, where someone plugs in a network cable and a power cable and they're able to get cloud-like experience, a public cloud-like experience on a device, that opens a significant number of doors. You eliminate multi-tenancy issues, for example, which is a huge obstacle when you come to compliance. And then in addition to that, you have to address what we call noisy neighbor issues and performance issues and failovers and stuff like that that are caused by those things. And if you were able to simply deploy a cloud appliance that is self-aware and behaves and acts like that, you have a whole nother trajectory towards technology. And I'm actively encouraged to see what Microsoft and Amazon do to press that further. I just wanted to tack that on to what Paulo was talking about.
Right, and the self-contained deployments using Docker and Kubernetes, where everything that's required to go through and run pretty much autonomously, even the software-defined networks, allow all that configuration to be deployed so it actually knows where its point of persistence needs to be, regardless of where it's actually ending up being deployed. And again, this is, I think, to an earlier comment, the technology is quite far ahead. It is still maturing. I don't think it is fully mature to everybody's liking, but I think that there are some very, very encouraging steps. And as long as we go in eyes wide open, I think that there are certain things that we will allow to go through and use those technologies, while we do have some stuff which is still pinned to some bare metal type hardware and some legacy stuff. As those things start behaving in a hybrid fashion as well, we'll start migrating off those at an accelerated pace once we get all the security and guidelines set up.
Well, to Robert's point that we're on the threshold of opening some new doors on major capabilities, it seems to me that Real-Time Payments International is a use case that helps accelerate the walk through that door. And so tell us, Paulo, what are some of the major requirements you have, Real-Time Payments International, for extending real-time payments into a globalized environment where localized issues can be accounted for, but still you gain the opportunity to have the lower latency issues that you need and being able to process in a way that's secure and falls into compliance. So what is it, the check boxes that you need to sign off on in order to be able to do what you want to do in a cloud? And I think that will give us some visibility in what other use cases might be coming.
Well, I can give you a couple. I can't give you all the criteria because for instance, persistence layer needs to be highly encrypted. The transports need to be highly encrypted. Every time anything is persisted, it has to go through a regulatory set of checks just to make sure that it's allowed to do it where it's being asked to do it. We do need a lot of cleanliness in the way metrics are captured so that you can't use a metric to get back to a person. If nothing else, we've learned a lot from the recent announcements by Facebook and by Marriott and Equifax, etc. The data is quite prevalent out there, and payments data, just like your hospital data, is the most personal. And I think that as we start figuring out what the nuances of regulation mean to an individual service that we're providing, that it must be externalized so that we can literally go through and at runtime inject regulatory requirements, not hard coding it or creating anything that's quote unquote ambiguous. You're starting to see a lot of effort going into how AI can help that and starting to check services, check their configurations, make sure that it can test every possibility so that there isn't a quote unquote hole that somebody can go through with a certain amount of credentials. So I think that as we go forward, those are the types of things that when we're in the public cloud, we need to account for when we were internal we had a lot of perimeter defense. The perimeter becomes a little bit more nebulous in a public cloud, right? So you can create virtual private clouds, but you do need to go through and be very wary that you're expanding the attack vector, and that's just one thing which we have to be careful with.
And if you can go through and check off these, and I know you can't be too detailed for obvious reasons, but if you are able to check these off and you are able to start exploiting the public cloud and private and hybrid cloud continuum across these different localities, these different regions, what do you get? What is the business outcome that you're seeking, and what do end users perhaps start to enjoy when this can come to a full fruition?
I think a couple of things. One, agility in terms of I can deploy to adjacent countries if a country's having a major outage. I think ease of access to a payments grade network without having to go through and put hardware, which will fail invariably, to be able to make it like a soft point that you can go through, and also the ability to scale. We're still in peak season, but peak season is more around Christmas holidays and so on, but there could be a peak season based on bad news, right? Not peak season, but a peak day. How do you go through and have your systems scale within one country that wasn't normally producing a lot of transactions? All of a sudden now it's producing 18 times the amount of transactions. Those types of things come in, and it also gives us a slightly different development paradigm where we have a lot of developers here. It gives us a certain level of consistency. It gives us the ability to be clean in how we go through and automate deployment, the testing side of it, the security checks, etc. Where depending upon the language, depending upon the target before, there was a lot of different bespoke ways of doing things. Bringing that together will just go through an increased velocity and reduce cost in most cases. And what I mean by most cases is I can use only what I need and scale as I require it. I don't have to build for the worst possible day and then potentially never hit it, right? So I've got I can use my capacity a little more efficiently.
Robert, it sounds like major financial applications like a real-time payment solution are starting to get what I suppose startups and cloud-native organizations took for granted or take for granted. It seems that we're getting some of the benefits of cloud, but now taking it to some of the most extreme and complex use cases. I think you could describe this as software-defined financial network. What does that say for the future of other industries and businesses when it comes to recognizing the cloud isn't just for certain applications and certain workloads, but under the right circumstances can be used for almost anything?
Yeah, that's a really, really good observation, Dan. I consider, we were just on a call earlier with a healthcare organization you can use the same language, right? They never go down industrial strength transaction platform that allows them to deliver healthcare solutions globally. And they're asking themselves, how do we bring on what they deemed as a future-proof infrastructure solution? One of the big advantages of the public cloud has been the isolation of all those things that many central teams have to do day in and day out. That it's patch release, upgrading processes, constantly looking at the refresh. They call it painting the Golden Gate Bridge, right? Once you finish painting the bridge, you got to go back and do it again. And a lot of that effort and money is going into that refresh process. And so they're asking themselves, hey, how can we take of our $3 or $4 billion spend, how do we take X amount of that and start applying it to really towards innovation? And if someone can take that piece out of the equation for folks, all things are eligible then. Everybody's asking the same questions. How do I compete globally in a way that allows me to build the agility transformation into my organization? And right now there's so much rigidity in place comparatively, but the balance against what Paul is talking about the industrial grade network, industrial grade transaction framework to get this stuff done cannot be relinquished. So people are asking a lot of these same questions. They're coming in, they ask, like for us at CTP, they say, hey, what use cases are actually in place today where that I can start leveraging portions of the public cloud for this so I can start knocking off pieces? I'd like to pivot it over to Paulo on something to dovetail on what he's asking on the same topic. How do you look at using your existing infrastructure that you have today and saying what portion of the cloud enablement can you bring to the table? I mean, is it a cloud first? You say, hey, everything's up for grabs, or are you more isolating yourself into a certain segment? I think that goes back to what you're asking, Dana. How do I pick the right pieces to be used here?
Right. There's a couple within that. I mean, obviously the end game, right? The overall end game is to be in the cloud 100%, right? That's kind of utopian. How do we get there from here? And like you said, there is analysis that is being done. And depending upon if we're talking about real-time ACH payments, which is actually more prepared to go into the cloud than, for instance, some of the core processing that handles most of North America and Europe from a individual credit card or debit card swipe. Some of those pieces need a little bit more rewiring to go through and take advantage of the cloud. When we start taking a look at it, we are decomposing all of the legacy systems and seeing how well they fit in what we call a paved path of patterns. Those patterns, if there is a paved path for that specific type of pattern, we would go through then and start putting it on the list of things that would transition to being built as a cloud native service. And then we would run it alongside its parent for a little while, right, to test it through stressful periods and through forced chaos, meaning if the segment goes down, where does it go through and flip over to, and what is the recovery time? The one thing we cannot do is we cannot in any way afford to increase latency. In fact, we've got some very aggressive targets to reduce latency wherever we are. So not just the latency, but the recovery and also the security side of it on individual components, which we end up calling value-added services as well. So there are some basic services which we have to provide, and then value-add, which people can opt in or opt out of. But those are the things where we do have a plan and a strategy for how to go through and prioritize that whole list.
And Paulo, as you're seeking to make this vision a reality, you have to master multi-cloud, you have to master hybrid cloud, you have to master security and latency issues. It seems to me that having visibility and monitoring across these different organizations' approaches, models, is a new kind of monitoring, a new kind of management. What do you look to for organizations like Cloud Technology Partners and Hewlett-Packard Enterprise to help reach that new level of insight so that you can manage and know what you're actually getting, measure what's going on, and therefore start to optimize and automate?
It's a great question. Cloud Technology Partners has been, very, very good and integral in our first set of steps into the cloud. Now, I'll give you one disclaimer. We have some companies that are Mastercard companies that are already in the cloud and were born in the cloud. So we do have experience with AWS. We do have experience with Azure, and we have some experience also with GCP. So this is not that Mastercard isn't in the cloud already. It is, but when you start taking the entire plant, as it were, and were to move it, we want to make sure that the security controls, which CTP has been helping ratify, get extended into the cloud, and where appropriate, actually removed, because there are better ones in the cloud today. Now, the next phase is to start building not just the pipeline to be able to deliver into that receptacle, but also create a cloud management office. That cloud management office was created last year, early in the year. It is now getting the appropriate checks and audits put into it from finance, the application teams, the architecture teams, security teams, and so on, so that as that list of applications which are prioritized come through, that they have the appropriate paved path, check, and balance. If there are any exceptions to that, it gets fiercely debated and will either get a pass or it will not. But even if it does not, it can still sit within our on-prem version of the cloud, just more protected. So as we start routing all the traffic and everything, that is where there's going to be a lot of checks within the different network hops that it has to take to prevent certain information from getting outside when it's not appropriate.
And is there something of a wish list that you might have for how to better fulfill the mandate of that management office? What are you looking to the vendors and the cloud providers to give you in order to continue to progress?
Well, we've got, obviously, cloud technology partners. HPE purchased CTP and also purchased Red Pixie. They cover, between the two of those acquisitions, using the same CTP methodology, they cover all cloud providers. Now, within that, rather than us, and this is where, forgive me for saying this, the cloud providers themselves are selling you the next feature function to move themselves ahead of their competitor. What CTP and Red Pixie are doing is they're taking the common denominator across all of them to make sure that you're not overstepping promises from one cloud provider into another cloud provider. So you're not thinking that everybody's at the same pace. Now, they also provide implementation capabilities, migration capabilities, and testing capabilities through the larger HPE organization. So the fact that, we've got strong relationships with Microsoft, strong relationships with Amazon, HPE does as well, so that bringing that collective muscle of Mastercard, HPE, and the cloud providers together, I think that we can go through and move mountains.
Robert, are there any misconceptions still in the market when you hear folks like Paolo describe what their vision is and what's possible when you can use all the cloud providers, but in some sort of a orchestrated concert, a value-add approach? Are there people in the market that don't understand that this is going on, and what would you want them to know? What's changed in the way in which people can consume across multiple clouds and leverage and exploit hybrid cloud that they should be aware of in terms of bringing new innovation and new efficiency and productivity to mission-critical things like real-time payments?
We're in a cycle right now where a hybrid world is the true reality. Just the complexity of the enterprise estates, no matter what industry you're in, has caused the centers of gravity of just these application center gravities where the latency issues between applications that could be moved to cloud or be used in cloud and those that cannot, where the data resides, create just huge latency issues. And so they are unable to take advantage of some of these frameworks that the public clouds provide. So the reality is that the public cloud is going to have to come down or come into the four walls of the enterprise. And as a result of that, we're seeing an explosion of abstraction, an explosion of commonality of there's going to be some open sourced framework for all clouds to communicate and to talk and to behave, right? So if you think of everything that's happened so far in the last decade with on-prem and the OpenStack world, and then the effect of basically decommissioning of that whole technology stack to not commissioning, but just moving it off to the side as a priority and adopting public. With the reality now is that we got regional issues, we got government issues, we got data privacy issues, we got all sorts of things that are pulling it back internally again, and nationalization. So out of all this chaos is going to rise, figuratively, metaphorically, a phoenix of some sort of framework. There has to be. There's no other way out of this. And to that extent, we are seeing organizations such as Paolo's and others having a mandate that we will always take the agile step forward towards somebody giving us the ability to let us do more of our business value versus the technology, right, to managing and keeping track of infrastructure and all those future-proofing that platform. But at the same time, having a technology position where that I can use common frameworks, common languages, things that give me interoperability across multiple platforms. And that's where you're really seeing huge amounts of investment. I don't know if you recently saw that HashiCorp just got $100 million in additional funding, and they got valuation of almost $2 billion. This is a company that specializes in sitting in that space. And we're going to just continue to see more of that. And as folks like Mastercard start really driving the requirements, this all-in on one public cloud mentality that has been in place in the previous couple last years is going to quickly evaporate. These platforms absolutely have to learn how to play together and get along with the on-prem as well as between themselves.
Paolo, any last thoughts about how we get cloud providers to be team players rather than walking around with sharp elbows?
I think it's actually going to end up being a lot more of the technology that's being allowed to run on these cloud platforms is going to take care of it. I mentioned Kubernetes and Docker earlier, and there are others out there as well. But the fact that they can go through and isolate themselves from the cloud provider itself is really where it's going to neutralize some of the sharp elbowing that goes on. Now, there are going to be features that keep coming up that I think companies like ours will take a look at and start putting workloads where the latest cutting-edge feature gives us a competitive advantage, and then wait for other cloud providers to go through and catch up. And when they do, we can then deploy out on those. But those will be very conscious decisions. And, I don't think that there is a one cloud fits all. But where appropriate, we will go through and be absolutely multi-cloud. But where there is defining difference, we will go through and select the cloud provider that best suits in that area to cover that specific, capability.
Yes, well, it sounds like these extreme use cases and the very important requirements that organizations like Mastercard have will compel this marketplace to continue rather than it become a one-size-fits-all. So an interesting time that we're seeing the maturation of the applications and use cases actually start to create more of a democratization of cloud in the marketplace. So I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. We've been exploring how a major financial transactions provider is exploiting cloud models to extend a distributed real-time payments capacity across the globe. And we've learned how the need for localized data storage and privacy regulations compliance and even lightning-fast transaction speeds are pushing the boundaries of what cloud solutions can do and how they're going to do it. So please join me in thanking our guests. We've been here with Paolo Pellizzoli. He's Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer at Real-Time Payments International for Mastercard. Thank you so much, Paolo.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
And we've also been joined by Robert Christensen, Vice President and Cloud Strategist at Cloud Technology Partners, a Hewlett-Packard Enterprise company. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
And a big thank you as well to our audience for joining us for this BriefingsDirect Voice of the Customer Hybrid IT and Cloud Computing Strategies interview. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host for this ongoing series of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise-sponsored discussions. Thanks again for listening. Please pass this along to your IT community and do come back next time.